Hello, welcome. In a dark Roman prison cell, iron chains around his wrists, and the real possibility of execution hanging over every hour, Paul took up his pen and wrote words that still steady anxious hearts. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Finally, think on whatever is true, noble, right, pure, lovely, and admirable. Put into practice what you have learned. These are not soft slogans for comfortable days or simple advice to stay positive. They form a clear psychological and spiritual protocol written by a man in chains facing death. The guards outside heard the steady voice of someone who refused to let fear rule. The believers in Philippi received the letter and began to live it under their own pressures. You may carry quiet anxiety of your own tonight, the kind that circles when sleep will not come. These narratives draw you into the cell with Paul, offering the same tested path that sustained him when circumstances gave no natural reason for peace. The man who wrote these words was in chains. Before a single line of Philippians 4:6-9 is examined for its content, the surroundings of its composition need to be held clearly in view, because those circumstances are not incidental background. They are the entire point. Paul was not writing from a retreat center. He was not composing these words in the comfortable silence of a study after a satisfying day. He was in Roman custody, chained, under guard, facing a legal process whose outcome included the genuine possibility of execution. The man who wrote, "Do not be anxious about anything," was a man for whom anxiety would have been the most natural and most understandable response to his actual situation. The man who wrote that the peace of God would guard your hearts was a man whose heart was living inside conditions designed to destroy peace. This context does not simply add dramatic interest to the passage. It is the passage's primary credential. These are not the words of someone theorizing about anxiety from a comfortable distance. They are the words of someone who had developed, through the sustained testing of a life that had required everything of him, an actual working practice for the real experience of acute stress, and who was deploying that practice in real time while writing the letter. If the peace Paul described was available to him in chains in Rome, it was available to the Philippian merchant whose trade was failing, the mother whose mind would not quiet, the believer whose circumstances were pressing from every side. The prison cell did not simply authenticate the teaching. It was the most powerful possible demonstration that the teaching was not a slogan, but a practice, something that had been tested to its breaking point and had held. What Paul laid out in verses 6-9 is not encouragement toward a more positive mindset. It is a sequential, multi-component practice for moving from anxiety to peace, one that modern psychology can now describe in neurological terms that Paul's first-century vocabulary did not require, but that his pastoral wisdom had already fully identified. The practice has 4 movements, each one building on the previous. First, bring everything. In every situation, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. The first movement is not suppression of the anxiety or argument against it or distraction from it. It is the deliberate, honest naming of what is present and the act of bringing it somewhere. Prayer is not the performance of a spiritual discipline. In this context, it is the act of transfer, of moving the ownership of the burden from the person carrying it to the God who is capable of actually addressing it. The thanksgiving is not gratitude for the problem. It is gratitude for the access, the acknowledgement that the relationship within which the anxiety can be brought somewhere is itself a gift, that the God to whom the petition is addressed is the kind of God who receives rather than dismisses, who is near rather than distant. Second, receive the guard, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. The peace that follows the transfer of the anxiety is not the peace of a problem solved. It is the peace of a burden genuinely released, the experiential, often surprising peace of a person who has brought what they were carrying to God and left it there rather than taking it back. The word guard, phrurio in the Greek, carried military connotations that Paul's Roman readers would have understood immediately. It described a garrison standing watch, protecting what had been entrusted to its care. The peace of God was not merely a pleasant feeling following prayer. It was a protective presence stationed at the entrance of the heart and mind, preventing the anxiety from re-entering through the channels it had been using to maintain its residence. Third, redirect the mind. Whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about these things. This is the movement that modern cognitive psychology calls attention training or cognitive redirection, the deliberate, practiced directing of the mind's focus away from the threat-saturated content that anxiety generates and toward content that sustains rather than depletes the resources the mind needs to function well. Paul was not prescribing denial of reality. He was prescribing a counter-curriculum for a mind that had been running a destructive curriculum, the rumination loop that rehearsed the worst possibilities without moving toward resolution. The categories he listed, true, noble, right, pure, lovely, admirable, excellent, praiseworthy, were not arbitrary virtues. They were descriptions of what God is like. To direct the mind toward these things was to direct it toward the character of the God who was near, to allow the content of thought to be shaped by divine reality rather than by the anxious projection of feared futures. Fourth, embody the practice. Whatever you have learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put it into practice. The protocol was not to be held as information. It was to be practiced into the body, acted out in the daily, repeated behaviors that convert a theoretical understanding into a lived reality. The practicing created what neuroscience now describes as neuroplasticity, the structural changes in the brain produced by repeated behavior, the formation of new neural pathways that make the practiced response increasingly available and the anxious response increasingly less dominant. The phrase, "the peace of God which transcends all understanding," has been so often quoted in contexts of comfort that its fuller and more interesting meaning has sometimes been obscured. Paul was not saying that the peace was beyond comprehension in the sense of being mysterious and inexplicable. He was making a more precise and more practically important claim, that the peace available through this practice was not produced by the resolution of the problems that had generated the anxiety. It transcended the understanding that a problem needed to be resolved before peace was available. It arrived genuinely, experientially, measurably, before the merchant's trade situation had improved, before the mother's fears had been addressed by the actual safety of her children, before the circumstances had changed in any of the ways that ordinary understanding would have required, before peace could be declared available. This was the remarkable countercultural claim of the passage. Not that faith produces good outcomes, that the peace of God is available inside the outcomes that are not yet good, guarding the heart and the mind in Christ Jesus while the chains are still on, while the trade is still disrupted, while the situation is still pressing, while the God who is near has not yet done what his nearness will eventually produce. Paul's chains rusted. The Roman Empire that imprisoned him dissolved. The city of Philippi was eventually buried beneath centuries of change until archaeologists found its stones. The practice has not dated. The anxiety it was written to address is as present in the modern world as it was in the Roman one, dressed in different clothing, generated by different circumstances, running through nervous systems shaped by different cultural pressures, but structurally identical to the anxiety that pressed on the Philippian believers and that Paul was managing in real time in his prison cell. The four movements remain the same. Bring everything to God in prayer with thanksgiving. Receive the peace that comes from the genuine transfer of what was being carried. Redirect the mind deliberately toward the content that sustains rather than depletes. Practice the protocol into the body through repeated daily embodied action. And the God of peace, not as a concept or a comfort, but as a presence, will be with you. Philippi was not an ordinary provincial town. It was a Roman colony, a city that had been deliberately settled with Roman veterans following the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC, granted the legal status of a colony with all the privileges that designation carried, and organized around an identity of Roman citizenship and Roman loyalty that permeated its social, economic, and religious life. To be a citizen of Philippi was to be, in a meaningful sense, a citizen of Rome in miniature. The city's institutions, its civic calendar, its public worship, its commercial networks, all of it was organized around the claims of the imperial system, and the believers living within it were navigating daily the friction of belonging to a community whose ultimate allegiance lay elsewhere. The tension was not merely theological, it was practical, economic, and social. A community of people who had declared their primary citizenship to be in heaven, as Paul wrote in the same letter, while living in a city that organized everything around the claims of Rome. The economic pressures were real. Commerce in a Roman colony was embedded in networks of social obligation, religious participation, and guild membership that made maintaining commercial relationships difficult for those whose faith created friction with the practices those relationships required. The social pressures were equally tangible. The cost of belonging to a movement that the surrounding culture regarded with suspicion, and that the authorities regarded with the hostility that had already produced Paul's imprisonment. Into these historically grounded conditions, a letter arrived from a man in chains. The authority of Philippians 4:6-9 derives almost entirely from the conditions under which it was written. This cannot be overstated. The passage is not primarily a philosophical argument about the benefits of positive thinking or a theological proposition about the nature of divine peace. It is a practice field-tested in the most extreme conditions the person writing it had yet faced, communicated to people under pressure by a man under considerably greater pressure who had found that the practice worked. Paul's imprisonment in Rome around AD 60 to 62 was not a brief inconvenience. He had been in custody for an extended period, had already stood before multiple authorities at multiple levels of the Roman legal system, and faced the genuine possibility that the process would end with his execution. The letter to the Philippians was written with this possibility in view, written by a man who was not certain he would survive the circumstances surrounding the writing. Do not be anxious about anything. These words, written by anyone else in any other circumstance, might legitimately be dismissed as the easy instruction of someone who did not understand what anxiety felt like from the inside. Written by Paul in chains facing potential execution, they carried the uncopiable weight of testimony, the report of someone who had practiced what he was prescribing in conditions that would have defeated any purely theoretical commitment to peace. The early Christian communities understood this. When they treasured this letter and copied it and circulated it among the churches, which they did early and persistently, they were not treasuring it primarily as good advice. They were treasuring it as the testimony of a man whose circumstances validated everything his words claimed. The practice came from the prison. That was its credential. The theological depth of the passage is contained in its structure, which is not simply a collection of good spiritual practices, but a deliberately ordered protocol in which each movement creates the conditions for the next. In every situation, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. The sequence begins not with the management of anxiety through internal discipline, but with the external act of transfer, the bringing of what is being carried to the one who is capable of actually bearing it. Paul was not prescribing the suppression of anxiety through willpower. He was prescribing the deliberate, honest movement of anxiety from the person experiencing it to the God who receives it. The thanksgiving embedded in the petition was the acknowledgement that the relationship within which this transfer is possible is itself a gift, that access to a God who receives rather than dismisses is not self-evident and deserves to be named as the grace it is. The peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. The military language of guard, Frurio, the standing watch of a garrison protecting what has been entrusted to its care, was not accidental in a letter written from Roman imprisonment to a Roman colony. Paul's audience lived with the visible reality of military guard in their city and understood immediately what it meant for a garrison to stand watch. The peace he was describing was not a feeling that followed from favorable circumstances. It was a protective presence stationed at the entrance of the heart and mind, preventing the anxiety from re-entering through the channels it had been using once the transfer of the burden had been made. Think about these things. The redirection of thought that Paul prescribed was not mere positive thinking. The naive suggestion that anxiety dissolves when you choose to look on the bright side. It was the deliberate, practiced direction of the mind's attention toward a category of content: true, noble, right, pure, lovely, admirable, excellent, praiseworthy, that was chosen precisely because it was incompatible with the ruminating, threat-focused content that anxiety generates and that feeds on the resources of the mind it occupies. The categories Paul listed were not arbitrary virtues. They were, in the Hebrew tradition from which Paul was operating, descriptions of God's character, and to direct the mind toward them was to direct it toward the reality of who God was, rather than toward the projected fears of what circumstances might produce. Put it into practice. The protocol culminated not in understanding, but in embodied behavior. Whatever they had learned, received, heard, or seen in Paul, the actual practices of his life, the observable behaviors of someone who had found that this protocol worked under the most extreme conditions available, they were to put into practice, not hold as information. Practice into the body. The most important theological claim of the passage is contained in the distinction between two possible definitions of peace: the peace the world offers, the peace that the Roman Pax claimed to provide, the peace that any human system promises as the reward for sufficient compliance with its requirements, is the peace of resolved problems. It is the peace of circumstances that have improved to the point that the threats generating the anxiety are no longer present. It is contingent on the conditions being right, which means it is hostage to the conditions, which means it is as unstable as the conditions are. The peace Paul described transcended this. It transcended the understanding that peace requires its conditions to be favorable. It was available inside the unfavorable conditions. It was guarding Paul's heart in the cell. It was available to the Philippian merchant in the trade disruption, and the Philippian mother in the sleepless worry, and the Philippian community in the social pressure of belonging to a faith that their city's dominant culture regarded with suspicion. The theological claim was precise. The peace of God is not the absence of trouble. It is the presence of Christ in the midst of trouble, the experiential, measurable presence of the God of peace accompanying the person who is practicing the protocol in whatever circumstances the practicing finds them. Paul was in chains when he wrote this. The peace was present in the chains. That is the theology. And it has never been more powerfully demonstrated than by the steady voice the guards outside his cell could hear. A man in custody, facing death, dictating a letter about peace to people he loved, from a position of genuine, practiced, tested experience of everything he was describing. Before examining what Paul's protocol does to the anxious mind, it is worth understanding what the anxious mind does to itself without intervention. Anxiety is not simply the presence of fear in response to genuine threat. It is the self-reinforcing cycle of a mind that has identified a threat, real or perceived, present or anticipated, and has begun circling it with the particular exhausting quality of attention that does not move toward resolution. The technical term is rumination, the repetitive return to the same worrying thought without productive outcome, the mental rehearsal of the worst possibilities without the movement toward any action that would address them. The merchant in Philippi, whose trade was disrupted, did not simply feel afraid once and then move on. He felt afraid and then reviewed the fear and then reviewed the review, and then projected the fear forward into increasingly elaborated scenarios of what the fear might eventually produce. This loop is not a character flaw. It is the nervous system doing what it was designed to do, directing sustained attention toward perceived threat in order to protect the organism from it. The problem is that rumination activates the same neurological stress response as the actual threat without producing the physical action that would eventually discharge the stress. The mind is working very hard and going nowhere. The body is carrying the physiological load of sustained danger without the release that genuine danger followed by genuine action would provide. Paul's protocol was designed to interrupt this loop at every stage. In every situation, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. The first movement of the protocol is the deliberate act of bringing the anxiety somewhere, of moving it from the closed circuit of the anxious mind into an open relational exchange with a God who receives it. This is not suppression. The anxiety is not being denied or pushed down. It is being named carefully and honestly and brought to the only one whose capacity to address it is genuinely adequate to the threat generating it. Modern psychology has consistently identified this movement, the act of expressing rather than suppressing a feared concern, as one of the most effective interventions in the management of acute anxiety. Naming the fear reduces its neurological intensity, bringing it into a relational context. Even the relational context of prayer activates the social engagement system of the nervous system, which is incompatible with the sustained activation of the threat response. You cannot be in full anxiety mode and in genuine relational connection simultaneously. The prayer interrupts the loop by introducing a different kind of engagement than the rumination was producing. The thanksgiving embedded in the petition adds a second neurological intervention. Genuine gratitude activates the parasympathetic nervous system, the branch responsible for rest and regulation, and is physiologically incompatible with the full activation of the stress response. Paul was not prescribing gratitude as an emotion to be generated by willpower. He was prescribing it as a practice, a deliberate direction of attention toward what was genuinely good in the present moment rather than what was genuinely threatening. And the practice, sustained, changes the physiological state of the person practicing it. The peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds. The military language here, frurio, the stationed garrison, describes what genuine transfer of the anxiety produces in the person who has actually brought it to God and left it there, a protective presence at the point of vulnerability. The anxious mind is most susceptible to the return of the anxiety through the channels that rumination has worn smooth, the familiar routes by which the feared thought re-enters and the loop resumes. The peace that guards does not simply replace the anxiety with comfort. It stands watch at the entry points, preventing the re-establishment of the cycle that the prayer has interrupted. Psychologically, this corresponds to what researchers describe as emotional regulation, the capacity of the nervous system to maintain a regulated state rather than being perpetually reactivated by the same stimuli. Genuine peace, once received, is not a static achievement that requires no maintenance. It is a dynamic protection that requires the ongoing practice of remaining under the guard rather than taking the burden back into one's own hands. Whatever is true, noble, right, pure, lovely, admirable, think about these things. The most psychological component of the protocol is the deliberate redirection of attention. The anxious mind has been running a curriculum, rehearsing threats, projecting worst cases, reviewing failures, anticipating losses. This curriculum is self-reinforcing. The more the mind attends to threatening content, the more accessible and emotionally charged that content becomes on the next iteration of the loop. Paul was prescribing counter-programming, not the suppression of the anxious thoughts. Suppression reliably produces the opposite effect, increasing the intrusive thought's frequency and intensity. But the active replacement of the thought curriculum with a different category of content, true, noble, lovely, admirable, that the mind can genuinely hold and that feeds a different kind of inner state. Modern cognitive behavioral therapy has validated this approach under the name of attention training or cognitive redirection. The research consistently shows that the deliberate practice of directing attention toward genuine goods that are actually present in the person's experience builds new neural pathways that gradually become more accessible and more automatic, displacing the threat-focused pathways that rumination has been reinforcing. Put it into practice, and the God of peace will be with you. The protocol does not end in understanding. It ends in action, the repeated, daily, embodied practice of the behaviors that the protocol describes. This is the movement that neuroplasticity research identifies as the mechanism of genuine change. Repeated behavior creates structural changes in the brain, building the pathways that make the protocol's responses increasingly automatic and the anxiety loop increasingly less dominant. The people in Philippi who practiced what Paul described, who brought their named anxieties to God in prayer with thanksgiving, who received the guarding peace, who deliberately redirected their attention to what was true and lovely, who repeated the practices until the practices became the shape of their daily life, described the same gradual outcome across the stories that have been preserved. Racing thoughts quieted, not immediately, not completely. Gradually, over sustained practice, the thoughts that had been running uncontrolled began to yield to the deliberate counter-movement of a mind that had found something to do with its anxiety other than circle it indefinitely. Paul knew this from chains. He wrote the protocol from experience, and the experience was available to everyone willing to practice what the chained man had practiced and had found in the practicing to be genuine. The harm that Philippians 4:6-9 was designed to prevent did not announce itself dramatically. It accumulated quietly, in the way that all slow damage accumulates, invisibly at first, then unmistakably, then in ways that required considerably more than the original intervention would have to address. The merchant in Philippi who received Paul's letter and read the words, "Do not be anxious about anything," and then set the letter aside and returned to his familiar pattern of circular worry, did not experience an immediate crisis. He experienced the gradual tightening of a life organized around the management of threat, the shrinking of his world to the dimensions of the problem he was circling, the the progressive unavailability of the attention and energy that genuine engagement with his family and community and faith required, the slow erosion of the sleep that sustained his capacity to function through the days that his worry was consuming. This is the first and most physically immediate damage of unaddressed anxiety. The biological cost of a nervous system maintained in sustained alert. Cortisol, elevated over weeks and months, produces measurable deterioration in sleep quality, immune function, cardiovascular health, and cognitive clarity. The merchant who could not stop running his calculations through the night was not simply experiencing a spiritual problem. His body was paying the physiological cost of a mind that had no mechanism for discharging what it was carrying. The second form of damage that the unaddressed anxiety produced was relational. The harm to the quality of connection that a mind perpetually occupied with threat could no longer sustain. Genuine relational presence requires a quality of attention that anxiety systematically undermines. The person in the grip of the rumination loop is not fully available to the people around them. Part of their attention is always elsewhere, cycling through the familiar circuit of the feared scenario, reviewing the threat from the angle they have not yet considered, projecting the anxiety forward into the next version of the worst case. The spouse noticed the absence before they could name its source. The child registered the distraction as something about themselves before understanding it was something about the world their parent was carrying. The community felt the withdrawal of the person whose anxiety had made genuine engagement progressively more costly than the isolation that had become easier to manage. Paul's letter was written to a community, not only to individuals, because the unaddressed anxiety of individual members was producing communal damage. The tensions that anxiety-driven people bring to community life, the guardedness, the suspicion, the reduced capacity for the generosity and openness that genuine community requires, were undermining the very relationships that the community needed in order to sustain its members through the pressures it was facing. The deepest and most lasting damage of the refused protocol was not the physical depletion or the relational withdrawal. It was the progressive hardening of a heart and mind that had been organized around fear for long enough that fear had become the primary interpretive lens through which everything was processed. The person who had been running the anxiety loop without intervention for months or years did not simply remain anxious. They became shaped by the anxiety, their perception of God, of other people, of their own capacity and worth, all filtered through the threat detection system that sustained anxiety had placed in charge of everything. What began as the natural human response to genuine pressure became the settled posture of a person who had lost access to the peace that Paul described, not because the peace was unavailable, but because the accumulated layers of unaddressed anxiety had made it increasingly difficult to receive. The prison Paul wrote from was external. The prison that unaddressed anxiety constructs is internal, and the walls of the second kind are, in some respects, harder to leave than the first. The protocol existed to prevent this. The damage accumulated in those who declined to use it, and the invitation to begin using it remained open, because the God of peace was present, and the protocol still worked, and the chains of anxiety were no more permanent than the chains on Paul's wrists had proven to be. how the change actually happens. The transformation that Philippians 4:6-9 produces does not arrive in a single dramatic moment of liberation from anxiety. It arrives the way all genuine formation arrives, gradually, through the repeated practice of behaviors that slowly displace the patterns they were designed to replace. Paul said he had learned the secret of contentment. The word he used implied a process, an apprenticeship, a curriculum, the kind of knowing that is acquired through experience rather than instruction. He had not arrived at the peace he was describing by reading about it. He had arrived at it through the sustained, imperfect, daily practice of the protocol across seasons of his life that had tested it to its breaking point. The Philippian believers who took the letter seriously and began practicing what it prescribed reported the same gradual movement. Not the sudden disappearance of the circumstances generating the anxiety. Rome was still occupied, the trade routes were still uncertain, the pressures were still real. But the relationship between the circumstances and the condition of the heart began to change, as it always changes when the protocol is practiced with sufficient consistency. The first thing to shift was the length of the loop. The person who had been circling the same feared scenario for hours without direction found that the deliberate interruption of prayer with thanksgiving, the careful, named transfer of the named anxiety to God, shortened the loop. The thought still came back, but it came back more slowly, and the pathway of bringing it to God rather than circling it again was becoming more accessible each time it was used. The peace that followed the prayer was not always immediate, but it was consistent, arriving not always in the moment the prayer ended, but reliably, in the hours that followed, as the guarding presence that Paul had described. The heart that had been contracted around the threat began to open slightly. The mind that had been running exclusively on threat-focused content began to find the other categories more available than they had been the week before. The most important dimension of the transformation was the one that Paul named at the end of the protocol. The God of peace will be with you, not as a reward for sufficient practice, not as the destination toward which the protocol was a means, as the presence that accompanied the practicing, present in the imperfect, incomplete, gradually improving daily repetition of a protocol that no one was executing perfectly and that was transforming everyone who was executing it consistently. The transformation the protocol produced was not the elimination of difficulty. Paul remained in chains through the writing of this letter and for some time after. The Philippians remained in a Roman colony with all the pressures that status produced. The circumstances that had generated the anxiety were not resolved by the practice of the protocol. What was resolved was the relationship between the person and their circumstances, the measurable, experiential shift from being controlled by the anxiety to being capable of inhabiting the circumstances that generated it without the anxiety determining the outcome. The God of peace was present in the cell. He was present in the market disruption. He was present in the sleepless worry and the uncertain future and the genuine pressures that had not abated. And his presence was sufficient, not to make the difficulty disappear, but to make the person carrying it genuinely, durably, increasingly free within it. This is the transformation the protocol was always designed to produce, and it is available to anyone who practices what Paul practiced, from whatever cell they are currently inhabiting. When anxiety rises, begin immediately. The first and most important practical instruction embedded in Philippians 4:6-9 is the timing. In every situation, not after the anxiety has been analyzed and understood, not after you have determined whether it meets the threshold of significance that justifies bringing it to God. In every situation, when it rises. The anxious mind's default response to rising anxiety is to engage it, to begin the review of the feared scenario, to start running the calculations, to open the familiar loop that will occupy the next hour or the next sleepless night without moving toward resolution. The protocol's first practical instruction is to interrupt this default before it gains momentum. The window between the arrival of the anxiety and the beginning of the loop is the most important window in the entire sequence. Use it deliberately. Stop. Name what you are anxious about with careful honesty. Not a vague general anxiety, but the named particular thing that has arrived and is pressing for attention. Then bring it directly to God in prayer, stated plainly. This is what I am afraid of. This is what I am asking you about. Add the thanksgiving, not for the problem, but for the access, for the relationship within which the bringing is possible, for the evidence of God's past faithfulness that the present pressure has not erased. This is the transfer. The anxiety that was circling has been brought somewhere. Make it actual rather than theoretical. Speak it aloud if that helps make it real. Write it down if that helps make it clear. The more concrete the naming and the bringing, the more genuine the transfer. Receive the guard. Do not retrieve what you brought. The second practical step is the one most commonly skipped, receiving the peace rather than retrieving the anxiety. Prayer has brought the anxiety to God. The protocol's promise is that the peace of God will guard the heart and mind, will stand watch at the entry points through which the anxiety will attempt to return. The practical work of receiving this peace is the deliberate refusal to take back what has been handed over. This looks like noticing when the familiar loop begins to restart, when the mind reaches for the scenario that was just brought to God and begins circling it again, and making the conscious choice not to follow it. Not because the concern is not real, because it has been placed in hands that are more capable of holding it than yours are, and the reaching back does not help the God who received it and only harms the peace he offered in exchange. Redirect the mind deliberately. The third step requires clarity. The categories Paul listed, true, noble, right, pure, lovely, admirable, excellent, praiseworthy, are not generic positive thinking. They are an alternative curriculum to what the anxiety was running. Name 3 things currently present in your life that meet one of these categories. Not imagined future goods, but present actual ones. The person who loves you, the provision that arrived this week, the beauty that is genuinely available in your immediate environment, the evidence of God's faithfulness in your personal history. Practice this naming in the morning before the anxiety has fully established itself for the day. Practice it midday when the loop is running. Practice it in the evening before the night makes the thoughts louder. The practice builds the pathway. The pathway becomes more available than the loop. Over time, the redirection requires less deliberate effort because it has become more habitual than the pattern it was replacing. Practice and share. Whatever you have received from this passage, put it into practice rather than holding it as information. Practice it today in the form your present anxiety currently requires. Return to the sequence when the pressure returns, without the discouragement of someone who expected the practice to be a one-time resolution rather than an ongoing protocol. Then share it. Not as advice dispensed from a position of having solved the problem, but as the testimony of someone who is practicing what Paul practiced, and finding in the practicing the same God of peace that the chained man found in his cell. In the prison cell, Paul finished the letter with chains still on his wrists. The words traveled to Philippi and beyond. Families read them by lamplight and began to practice the protocol. A man facing loss learned to pray with thanksgiving. A woman with racing thoughts trained her mind on what is pure. The God of peace stayed with them. Across the years, the same instructions have reached others in their own hard places. A prisoner later echoed the words. A parent facing uncertainty followed the sequence and found quiet strength. The protocol remains, written by a man who lived it under the shadow of execution. You rest now in these same directions. Do not be anxious. Present every request with thanksgiving. Let peace guard you. Think on what is excellent. Put it into practice. Sleep comes gently, carrying the assurance that the God of peace is with you, just as he was with Paul in the chains. The story continues, steady and true. Rest well.